My name is Joel Kushai, and I teach at Queensborough Community College, part of the City University of New York. I moved to Queens in 2006 when I started working at Queensborough, and knew immediately that I wanted to be part of the community, and I really took the community and community college really seriously, and was immediately active in like neighborhood issues and that sort of thing. And there's a tradition of Archie Bunker, and it goes on and on and on. And having moved there, I became kind of astonished at sort of how much it was still around, and how much it, even though say older white people were becoming a minority, and I found kind of traces of kind of rhetorical positioning about outsiders and by implication foreigners, but also like somebody like myself who might move here from another part of the state or another state and really, working.
Oh, while the Estradas are thinking it over, you and Henry are trying to find somebody else to buy the house.
You don't call that crooked? No, that's looking out for number one.
Where does that place Henry Jefferson?
He's number two. Why is he number two? Because, meathead, there can only be one number one and one number two. And life made Jefferson number two long before I come along.
This kind of outsiderism and this kind of language that was used to describe others, whether they're from another neighborhood or, from another country or whatnot. And in any event, I became very, very disturbed by it. And as I got involved in community politics, like I was on the local community board, I saw it more and more, and some of it was upsetting. I obtained access to the papers of one of the units of the Klan in Queens, the Richmond Hill unit. There were officially known, according to the New York State Attorney General in 1946, said there were 8 in Queens in the 20s, but I found that there were more than that. One of those units kept meticulous records. Presumably they all did at some level, but one of them was sort of a widely regarded, they were a strong group, and they sort of, I wouldn't say that they were a training ground, but that has been claimed of them, that they were training people who came. And they left papers in possession of their longtime secretary and his brother. And over the years, they just were never destroyed. And then when he passed, they were put on the street. By 23, the Queens group that we have records for fully appears on the scene with about maybe 500, 600 members. In many cases, the buildings are still there because they were, brick buildings from the teens and 20s, and so they remain. And in some cases they don't. And then you see, in these pictures where you see where once the Ku Klux Klan met, the people who were maybe walking by on a Google Street View picture represent the intense and incredible diversity of Queens, where white people are 16% of my neighborhood. And I think that's, probably pretty typical for Queens, of maybe higher in some neighborhoods and much, much, much lower in other neighborhoods. And I immediately went through and sort of went through as fast as I could to look for any references to names, any references to places or other publications, or any clues about anything concrete that I could sink my teeth into, because it's just more data points for my desire to kind of create this sort of whole narrative, this whole picture of the members, yes, but the broader community that supported them and in which they existed. So there's just so much of it is lost that it's like the most incredible thing to have them together. And I know there's more out there. I hope we can get more of them scanned and included, because it's the most invaluable thing to be able to go and see the data points. There's a little bit online, but very, very little. And so you really don't get a sense that you can get from looking at like a full run of what's available, whether it's an actual full run or just that there's 8 issues. You really start to see the mindset, and you start to see the patterns of thought and this sort of maybe kind of foundational rhetorical principles that underwrite a lot of the arguments that they do make. And so that's sort of like a long haul to sort of do that kind of rhetorical analysis, but without it, you wouldn't really ever know. As they did meet around the corner from a movie theater over there in Richmond Hill, they initiated a protest against the showing of the film The Pilgrim by Charlie Chaplin. So the Klan had a meeting, and they were talking about, presumably, that this film was being shown on Sunday in a couple of days. And they didn't like this movie, The Pilgrim, and they didn't like Charlie Chaplin. So They went over there and delivered a threatening note to the manager, basically threatening violence if they didn't pull down that bill and put up something else, show a different movie on Sunday. And the movie theater agreed. They were against the film because it made fun of a Protestant minister, that it's 3D, it's not just these cartoon monsters from the past. And I do think that they're terrible, but I think they're still around, and that ability to hide behind the cloak of respectability, which you see a lot more in the North, I think, than maybe in the South. I worked really hard not to be neutral, because I'm certainly not neutral, but to be focused on recovering as much as could be recovered. Well, I think most basically because it's history does repeat itself. And some of the patterns that we see looking at the 20s, I think, are clearly in play now. And some of the strategies that were undertaken to fight against them. The newspaper in Chicago, Tolerance, was put out by a group that their primary mission was to name names of members, and they got people would steal membership lists and send them to them. And I do think that type of activity made a difference. And sometimes an old student will comment like, "Oh my God, I had no idea." And these are students who grew up in like, let's say maybe the Caribbean and Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico or Haiti, and then they're come over here as children. And I love that, because I think it's helpful for them to know. And I think and that sometimes it may be, it's like it's freaky, but also that sense that maybe it's not a surprise that there may be residual racism, because the buildings are still there and nobody ever talked about it. Nobody ever said anything about it. And so, yeah, I'd like to go look at the buildings. I know where a lot of them lived, and it's very interesting, and it's sobering to walk around, and I could take you down a street where I know half a dozen of them lived. I think, as somebody looking at white supremacy in Queens, I think there's a temptation to say, "Oh, it's not here. It's not. I'm not part of this. It's not." But I think, yes, if you are living in Queens, if you're living in America, you're part of it. And I think so. It makes sense to look at people who were so-called normal or typical, and then to sort of crack open what typical might have meant. Maybe it doesn't mean that they're harming people and doing violence, but what is it that they're doing, and like, how does that contribute to normalizing violence, or normalizing division, or normalizing redlining, or kind of a exclusivity